We are in the middle of the 20th chapter of Genesis. Things are just heating up. Let me give you a brief recap of what we've talked about thus far in this chapter. It's going to be brief, both because I'm not a fan of reviewing, as well as the fact is we haven't gone very far, so not much to review. So Abraham and Sarah leave the terebinths of Mamre, their friend Mamre, let them stay in his oak grove. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about their motivations to leave that place, to pull up as the original Hebrew word means. It's translated in the English journeyed there in Genesis 20, verse 1. God doesn't tell us why they decided to leave. Some say it was out of fear that the destruction that God was bringing down upon Sodom and Gomorrah would be extended to the place they called home. As you remember, I disagreed with that assumption. Yes, Abraham has his moments of doubt, but I don't think he feared for his life in this situation, not from God anyhow. God was pretty specific with him about who was in trouble and why. Abraham knew why those cities were destroyed. They were wicked and God had had enough. Abraham certainly wouldn't have worried about being caught up in that wrathful judgment. I think Abraham, ever the practical businessman, knew that with the destruction of the majority of his sales territory, it was probably a good idea to find greener pastures, as it were. Anyhow, Abraham and Sarah and their whole crew head south. They end up in a place called Gerar and immediately get themselves into a difficult spot due to really poor decision-making. Abraham once again goes around hiding the fact that Sarah is his wife. Now, he doesn't technically lie when he tells people she's his sister, but sort of lying is still lying. Yes, she is his sister, but she's also his wife. We long ago dealt with the ickiness of that fact, so let's just move on. And then probably out of ambition more than anything else, Abimelech, the local king, decides to take the 90-year-old Sarah as a potential candidate for marriage. Now, you've heard me opine that he's not really looking for a wife so much as a way to become connected with that wealthy rancher from the north who he says is the brother of Sarah. Abimelech is unaware of Abraham and Sarah's full relationship, so he naively takes her to be part of his harem in an attempt to create a closer relationship between himself and the powerful rancher Abraham. Nonetheless, this is bad. Abraham and Sarah are on the brink of bringing the promised seed into the world. She's probably not pregnant yet, or only just so, but nonetheless, she is obviously a major part of God's plans for bringing about the Redeemer, so God has to act quickly. With no time to lose, God appears to Abimelech, that king, in a dream, and then he scolds him regarding taking this woman into his household. And that scolding comes off very aggressively. God threatens the man with death if he doesn't fix the problem. There we are. We're caught up. So back to the text. Right after God reprimands the king in that dream, we read Genesis 24, but Abimelech had not come near her. And he said, Lord, wilt thou slay also a righteous nation? Now, I don't want to be one of those guys who's always trying to stir the pot, but sometimes I wonder why the scholars are so sure of the traditional interpretation of certain passages, especially when the evidence doesn't line up for those interpretations. You've heard me come against this sort of thing before. Just because we've always thought a certain way about a passage doesn't mean it's a valid viewpoint. I often simply ask the question, why? Why do we believe this or that about a particular section of Scripture? Now, I hope you don't think I'm just trying to pretend to be smarter than everyone else, because I'm not. I'm not trying to be smarter, and I'm not smarter. It's just that I was raised in a denomination that literally imposed their interpretations of, well, everything, and no one was allowed to question it. And we never got a good explanation. It was just assumed we would accept the church's view of things dutifully. To question the established opinion was not only frowned upon, but it was pilloried. Asking why was the same as asking, may I have a smack on my knuckles? Same result. But now I'm free of that repression, so I'm going to ask why here. Why are we so sure that Abimelech is a so-called righteous king? That is the accepted opinion, that Abimelech is somehow a righteous king. Is it because God appeared to him? Is it because he seems to obey God? Is it because even after being played by the man, he treats Abraham with respect and generosity? And yes, I will agree, all of those things are signs of a righteous man. They're expressions of righteousness. But aren't they also signs of fear? You see, the problem with the way we approach the Bible, I think, leads to a great deal of misinterpretation. For centuries, the Bible's been studied and taught as if it were just a large collection of quippy sayings and interesting experiences and isolated observation. I mean, that's the way almost all so-called religious writings are treated. Everyone thinks you can just, hunt and peck your way through sacred writings until you find the answer to whatever's ailing you that day. I mean, we have daily devotions that consist of an isolated verse with some musings upon whatever's contained in it. We have Bible promise books that are full of little tiny scriptural snippets that we can read to make us feel better about what's happened in the past, whatever is going on in the moment, and or what might occur off in the future. They're very often segmented by subjects so that it's easy to locate, just the right holy morsel to get us through our problems. It's very neat and compartmentalized. Now, I know I sound a bit sarcastic, and maybe I am at the moment, but I don't want to give you the impression that I don't use the Bible in this very way myself, because I do. I love my daily devotions, and I really love my promise book. Look, like you, I really lean on those things for my spiritual health. But if we do that too much, or fail to develop an approach to Scripture that's more disciplined and more holistic, we risk missing the big picture. The Bible is a continuous collection of connected points of reference about our relationship with God. We should reference and study our Bible in a way that helps to remind us of the overall context of the rest of Scripture. And when we get into that habit, we will come across in our studies things that are connected in one way or another to the rest of Scripture. Just by way of quick example, when reading through the Gospel of Matthew, it is extremely helpful to be familiar with the Old Testament. You see, it's generally agreed that Matthew wrote his book about the life of Jesus from the Jewish perspective. This is how the great Scottish/English scholar and preacher Graham Scroggie puts it. He says Matthew's gospel is saturated with the Old Testament. The reason for this is that as it was the writer's design to prove the messiahship of Jesus, he had to draw his proofs from the Jews' Bible. And by the Jews' Bible, of course, he means the Hebrew Scriptures, what you and I call the Old Testament. In all, Scroggie counts at least 125 references to Old Testament passages in Matthew's Gospel. Therefore, this is my point, in order to fully understand, to properly and completely interpret Matthew's gospel, it's helpful to know the Old Testament. Listen, if you ignore that advice, you do so at your own peril. Of course, you're going to get something out of the Gospel of Matthew, but if you want to know it all, and listen, why study the Bible if you don't want to know it all? It is the most fascinating book ever produced. It has come to us from heaven. You should want to know it all. Well, if you want to know all about Matthew's gospel, your interpretations of the writings of Matthew are going to be impacted by an ignorance of the Old Testament. You are to get a broader perspective. A broad perspective of the entire Bible will help you smooth out any of the difficulties you might encounter when trying to understand not only the Gospel of Matthew, but all of Scripture. What's your point, John? The very best tool for understanding the Bible is the Bible. We mustn't exclusively take everything in snippets and extracts. Treat the Bible as a whole to get the most out of it. Certainly all of what God wanted us to get out of it. And bringing this back to Genesis, Abimelech's reactions to God's rebuke cannot be taken in isolation. We cannot assume that his behavior has some general cause to it, like, I don't know, the fact that he is a righteous man. He may be a righteous man, but we cannot assume that just because of the way he behaves here. And I think it's a mistake to assume he is, because we're going to miss a bigger point. There could be other explanations. We would need more information to be sure, but we don't have any more information, so we go with what we have. I believe we must examine the context of this situation if we really want to know why Abimelech said what he said and did what he did. And what is that context? What does the Bible tell us about the environment of Abimelech's actions? What was going on around him? Well, one big thing that happened at that time in his neighborhood, more or less, is that 4 cities lie in ruins because of wickedness, or so the rumor must have been reported. News of the destruction of those places must have made its way to Gerar by then, right? As well as the reported reason for the destruction. What? 4 cities completely destroyed? How? Why? Well, it was supposed to be the judgment from the God of someone named Abraham. His God told him that the 4 cities were disobedient and wicked, and he was going to destroy them, and he did destroy them. I don't know, but that just must be one powerful God. Now, whether Abimelech knew of Abraham's God or not, the rumor is someone's God just leveled an entire region and took out everyone that was there. Look, and unlike now, people in those days believed in supernatural sources. They believed that the supernatural was responsible for natural and otherwise disasters. You didn't have to try to convince them that a God did something like that. In fact, they suspect that's the cause every time something like that happens. And then when someone puts a name to that God, it's terrifying. Almost everyone, including kings, lived in absolute horror of going afoul of the wrong deity. And it didn't matter to anyone if they didn't know anything about that God or not. Just because they didn't know anything about a God didn't mean that God didn't exist. That's modern thinking. Today we go around poo-pooing things we know nothing about just because we don't know anything about them. We don't mind taking the chance that our ignorance has nothing to do with the truth of something. We think we know it all, and if we don't know something, it's not worth worrying about. Stupid, arrogant, and dangerous. The ancients, those cavemen, would never be so foolish. Certainly Abimelech was aware of what happened very recently up there in the valley of the Jordan River, right? We determined that destruction could not have occurred too long before the journey of Abraham and Sarah south to Gerar, the setting of this story. And we can be certain that Abimelech accepted the explanation, or was at least open to accepting the explanation that this guy, Abraham, his God, was responsible for the reported destruction. The horror of it must have still been fresh in everyone's mind. Therefore, with the horror of that still in the king's mind, this happens. God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "Behold, thou art but a dead man, for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife." With all of what has transpired in his world, how do you think he's going to react when he gets a visit from a God that knows who Abraham is, and he's telling you you're going to die? Well, I don't think you're going to get cute, as my mother would say. Abimelech is going to hop to it, whatever it is. He's going to snap to attention and fill the air with yes, God, no, God. Look, the unfortunate truth about human beings is fear is a far more effective motivator for good behavior than a sense of right or wrong. And I think what happens next is a glimpse into what's on the king's mind. I mean, look at the very first thing Abimelech says to God in response to God's promise of swift justice for wrongdoing. The king's first statement is, "Wilt thou slay also a righteous nation?" Who said anything about slaying any nation? God said, "You, Abimelech, are going to die." Why would you answer with a question about a righteous nation? Now, some will explain this as simply the king identifying himself with his people. If they die, he dies. If he dies, they die. Okay, I suppose that's not out of the question, but wouldn't you also think that Abimelech is a little concerned that God isn't quite done cleaning up around the region, that every mistake he makes could cause everyone to be wiped out? And this is what he's telling him. You're going to die. In fact, I would say, given the context, that's a little more likely than simply a king using some silly political language of unity. Now, once again, I have to warn you that I'm speculating. All of you know by now I'm not a Bible expert. I've been teaching the Bible for 16 years, but that doesn't mean anything. I never went to Bible college, never went to seminary. All I do is study the literature, no different than you. So always be leery about anything I say about Scripture that I tell you is a guess. This is a guess. We're not told why Abimelech was so willing to cooperate. Most of the real experts say it's because he's a righteous, God-fearing king. In fact, let me quote my man H.C. Leupold. He says, throughout, the king gives the impression of being an entirely worthy and upright character. And then this part, a man who truly feared God. Now, I broke that sentence into two parts for a reason. I want you to know that I think it's fairly safe to agree with both portions of this quote, but I don't agree, or I should say, I don't see how we can come to the conclusion or the connotation that we come to if we string these together. Let me explain. I believe it isn't a stretch to say that the king gives the impression of being entirely worthy and upright. Yes, all of his actions taken in totality through the end of this chapter and another, taken in totality, we can come to the conclusion that he is worthy and upright. The things he says, the things he does, shows he has principles. He seems patient and forgiving, and in the end, he's quite generous. Those things together can be interpreted, again, as being worthy and upright, to use Leupold's words. But I don't think his worthy and upright character comes from a reverence for the one true God, which leads to the second bit. Of course, Abimelech gives the impression of being a man who truly fears God, because I'm sure he does fear God. But I don't think this fear is anything of like a reverence fear. This is a terrified fear. Given what's here in Genesis, there's nothing that tells me this guy is a one true God worshiper. But everything tells me he is someone who knows the power of the supernatural, because surely he knows what happened to Sodom et al. Most recently, right? I checked the rest of Scripture to find examples of good and upright Abimelech, and I found out that he is an honorable king. We'll come to it soon, but at some point, this very same king strikes a covenant of peace and cooperation with Abraham. Okay, good. He's not aggressive. He's not a bloodthirsty pagan king. He's a relatively good guy. That's what we can assume from this action taken later on in the book of Genesis. But we can also assume that he's smart and he knows a good thing when he sees it. He shows the same tendency here in this chapter too. He knows it's a smart move, first of all, to not run afoul of a powerful deity. If being addressed by the God who just got done destroying tens of thousands of people for disobedience, the wise thing to do is be obedient. The other thing I will argue is that Abimelech knows it's smart business to get on the good side of a rich man like Abraham. He's a wealthy rancher that seems to have some connection to the supernatural. Wouldn't you agree that it would be prudent to get on friendly terms with a man like that, right? Treat his relatives well, give lots of gifts, honor, and respect. That's all I see here in chapter 20. A smart guy, a guy who makes good decisions, a guy who seems to respect the forces he doesn't understand and, well, frankly, feels he can leverage those unseen powers to his advantage. In my opinion, that's a much easier interpretation of this section than one that tells me that this king is somehow a worshiper of the same God we worship. He's a smart businessman who's terrified of the God who rained down destruction on the neighborhoods of the north. He knows full well who to treat with respect and reverence to not only stay alive, but maybe become a little rich. That's the information we have and not much else. All right, I spent way too much time on that, but I love this book. I love it so much that I am always trying to wring out all I can from it. Besides, we must get in the habit of seeking truth and not just consensus. I believe it's healthy and worthwhile to challenge these long-held interpretations of Scripture. In this case, the church has always taught that Abimelech was a believer, but I just don't see the evidence of that anywhere. Just because someone has a moral center does not mean they love God. Just because someone is wise enough to obey a God who visits them in a dream, doesn't mean they're righteous. Yes, he's probably a good guy, but the record we have leads me to believe that he's also self-interested and self-motivated. Now, I'm going to have one more thing to say about this in a future lesson, because there's another reference to the kings, or maybe to the kingdom's character in the upcoming verses. But that's probably good for now. We'll pick it up at this point next time. See you then.